Joan Baez, the forgotten legend, diamonds, and now rust. She was elusive, she was today, she was tomorrow. She was the faintest scent of an elf owl, the scent of a cactus flower. We did not know what to make of her. In our minds, we tried to pin her to a corkboard like a butterfly, but the pin merely went through, and away she flew. Come back with me 40 years ago to the rapid spring of 1970. President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, and campuses exploded. Kids who had never picked up rocks before in their lives were occupying the classrooms that they used to study in. When National Guardsmen shot 4 unarmed students at Kent State, virtually the entire system of higher education shuttered and stopped. The fabric of the country seemed to be tailing. Everything about the older generation was contaminated, corrupt. At the forefront of this movement of free speech was folk queen Joan Baez. But before Baez was risking her life for social causes like this, she was a sensitive and politically aware misfit. She came from a self-described gypsy family, and the PBS American Masters special, Joan Baez, How Sweet the Sound, Joan remembers, "I thought my family was different, special. My mother was more beautiful than anybody else. My father was smarter than anybody else. And I guess that's a great way to grow up." Her family moved frequently and even spent a year in Baghdad, Iraq. When living there, she realized, being brown-skinned, I was considered an Arab because I looked like one. That's kind of how it started, my feeling about how people wanted to be treated. Roger McGinn, singer-songwriter and lead guitarist of the Byrds, believes, "It's hard for people today to know how big Joan was. She was on the cover of Time, and she was it. The social causes she threw herself into during the 1960s and 1970s, the musical advances she made in the folk community, now are practically forgotten. She is unrecognized by the younger generations, despite that she is still touring. And this presents a major conflict. Joan Baez deserves to be given credit for her achievements as an artist and successful political activist. In 1956, for the first time, she hears a young Martin Luther Jr. King lecture on nonviolence and civil rights. It was a monumental moment in her life. It was the spark that pushed her on a path she couldn't have predicted. Baez says, "I always cried when I heard him speak. It is so moving and so real." Reverend Jesse Jackson recalled the tumultuous times, saying, "If whites and blacks were in the same car, you could be arrested." In that setting, which was hostile and dangerous, there was Joan Baez. She was so involved in the cause that Dr. King asked her to come to Grenada, Mississippi, because they were throwing rocks and bricks at little black kids when they were trying to integrate the schools. He couldn't get there, so he wanted a public figure there, get the press there, and people would eventually stop throwing rocks for a while. She remembers, "The image I have in my head is walking in Grenada, walking around the center of the town, and there was a little white boy who looked up, and I thought he was smiling. And I said, 'Hi.' And he said, 'Nigga lover.' I was just stunned, and I thought, okay, I guess I don't get to be the popularity queen of the world." I guarantee you that if any given American were asked who the most influential female during the civil rights movement was, their response would be Rosa Parks. Or if they were asked who the most transformational leader was, their answer would be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Yes, Rosa Parks and Dr. King had significant roles in the civil rights movement, but Joan Baez, if not more actively, fought for the desegregation of African Americans. Baez was also on the front line during the famous March on Washington, where King evoked his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. She sang Bob Dylan's "We Shall Overcome," which she was famously known for doing during the movement. She herself admits, "I don't remember anybody else who spoke." I guess most people probably don't. Even though King delivered a historically monumental speech to our country, this is not justification for American society to not remember that Joan Baez was also leading the movement. The rotunda of the United States Capitol, completed in 1824, has since been considered the most suitable place for the nation to pay final tribute to its most eminent citizens, by having their remains lie in state or in honor. Rosa Parks was the first non-government official to have this rare homage. Not to diminish Parks' courageous act, if it was just that, but Joan Baez, should also be given credit because of her commitment to nonviolence. Her and Dr. King often traveled together. They shared hotel suites, laughed constantly, and exchanged jokes. Baez can recall when we were in smaller groups and I was there and he was speaking, he would joke afterwards. He said, "I threw the word nonviolence in there a couple extra times. I know Sister Joan really loves hearing that." Reverend Jesse Jackson recalled their relationship saying, "Joan and Dr. King, I think it really was mutual admiration." While being in prison for blocking the entrance to an induction center during the anti-war movement, Dr. King publicly shared, "I just had the privilege of visiting my very dear friend Joan Baez and her mother. I decided as an expression of my appreciation for what they are doing for the peace movement and for what they have done for the civil rights movement, I will take time out of my schedule to come out to see them, to visit them, and to let them know that they have our absolute support." Very few people today remember that Joan Baez was so involved in the civil rights movement, and almost nobody knows or understands the connection she and Dr. King shared. She was also among the first musicians to have her concert audiences be racially mixed. Baez was unaware that her first contract clearly stated that her audiences were meant only to be white people. Upon realizing this, she immediately began to recruit black members of the community to come to her shows. She even went as far as singing with a teenage colored gospel choir. One member, the Bishop Ernest Palmer, calls to mind, "The shocking reality was, on this night, I'm singing with Joan Baez. Tomorrow, I've got to go down to the Tuscola County Courthouse and decide whether to drink from the colored water fountain or the white water fountain." She had an amazing ability to inspire people to think with their head and follow their heart. At a very young age, music, Baez realized, was what mattered to her most. It was the only thing she couldn't live without. She developed a diverse repertoire at an extremely young age, and her timing couldn't have been better. Baez got very famous very fast, just as folk music became a phenomenon. Shortly after she rose to stardom, she remembers, "When Dylan and his music entered my life, maybe I didn't know I had been looking for music, but I was certainly aware that something was missing, particularly when I heard what it was. I heard that music and I thought, oh my God, this is a link. This is a link between me and the world of music and politics, and all of it. I heard that music and it was clear that that was the direction to go." David Crosby, the founder of the Byrds, recalls, "Bob came from the same folk music background, the traditional music, but he was already writing his own songs. This is a guy who's an unbelievably good poet." This is another explanation as to why Baez is not recognized by today's youth. She did not write a lot of her own songs. In some ways, she was, and still is, a very talented cover artist. Sure, she wrote some of her own songs, but she was most famously known for making others, particularly Dylan's, memorized by an entire generation. Nevertheless, David Crosby believes the two of them were quite a force at the time. But shockingly, the folk community didn't respond positively to Dylan at first. She invited him to her concerts to give him publicity. She says, "It didn't take long before people got it, that he was pretty damn special." At the young age of 15, her parents purchased her her first guitar with her sister Mimi, and they started to practice folk music together. Unlike most musicians, Joan did not strum the guitar. Dylan describes, "She had a very unusual way of playing the guitar. I never heard anybody do it the way Joni did. I tried to practice it, but I couldn't get that style down." He goes on to say, "She had that heart-stopping soprano voice. I just couldn't get it out of my mind." Crosby feels she was extremely talented and knocked people off their feet. Even Dylan recognizes that Joan was a more talented musician, vocally anyway, although in later years he became baffled by her most famously written piece, Diamonds and Rust, which just so happens to be about the two of them and their love affair. Dylan and Baez were monumental during their shared spotlight time. Folk music became more important when the songs started being written, and it set the stage for it becoming a component of rock and roll that made rock and roll literature, and therefore made rock and roll an art form. Baez states, "I was the singer and he was the writer, and the two of us weren't just two people. We were a minimum of three. But we were in a bubble, and it didn't last."